Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
I guess we'll start. I think there may be one or two more people trickling in. But thank you guys for coming here today. And I know that there's conflict, so I appreciate everyone getting out here today. Sam Freiberger is a PhD candidate in economics at NYU, and this is the first of our postdoc talks for the new economics position. And he's going to be talking about peer-to-peer markets, and he does a lot of work in the intersection of data science and economics. So I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So I'm going to be talking about three topics, actually, today. The first one is about the sharing economy, and the question is, what happens to an economy when peer-to-peer rental markets become widespread? And then I'm going to be talking about two other questions, which are projects that are ongoing. So I'm going to be taking a little bit less time to talk about them. But I'm happy to talk about them more afterwards offline. So these two questions are, what's the relationship between personality traits, Facebook friendship, and embeddedness? And the last one is, can we improve the forecasting of macroeconomic indicators by using sentiment extracted from news articles? So they seem unrelated, but actually I'll show you that there is actually some link between them. OK, so let's start with the sharing economy. And this is actually part of a larger research agenda where we are trying to measure the effect of what people now call the sharing economy, which range from measuring consumption shifts and welfare effects to trust mechanisms, and that in collaboration with over a dozen peer-to-peer platforms. But before I give you some specific about the paper, let me provide some context. So a range of economic activity that used to be between a firm and a customer now have peer-to-peer counterparts that are mediated by the digital platform. And so this shift, which took place over the past 10 years or so, has been sometimes, although not always, paired with a shift from ownership to access. So what do I mean by that? Well, that instead of owning an asset, I can now access it or rent it when I need it. So that's just a picture to give you a sense of the type of things that can now be rented on sharing economy platforms. So basically, almost anything in a household now can be rented on the sharing economy platform. So what happens to an economy and a market more specifically when you introduce these peer-to-peer rental markets? Yeah, I've never tried, so I can't share my experience. But
renting a pain in the ass. Carry on.
OK, so I won't be talking about dogs today, but I'll be focusing on cars, because that's where my data are from. So 2 minutes on the economics of car ownership. It's very inefficient. And why is that? Because, well, first of all, cars are very expensive. So on average, they cost, this is Canadian dollars, something like $8,000 a year. And most of it comes from depreciation. So that's what the composition of the cost is. And a third, basically, of it is value depreciation. On the other hand, cars are underutilized. So that's the distribution of car usage in the US, with an average around 5%. That means that 95% of the time, cars are not used. What happens when you introduce peer-to-peer rental? Well, this is the picture of an app called GetAround, which is the company that we're partnering with and that's sharing their data with us. So it's an app that allows you to rent a car by the hour and unlock it directly with your phone. And that's the distribution of availability of cars on the platform. So you see that it mirrors the distribution of.
It's not perfectly the same, because this is not usage. This is just whether or not it's
This is
matter of fact. So
exactly.
on the road.
Yeah, it's only availability. So it's actually, given that a car is available, it's rented on average 10% of the time. I'll show you that later. There's actually still a lot of friction in this market. Okay, so that gives you a sense of some of the efficiency gains that are generated through these sharing platforms, right? You have expensive cars, which are underutilized, and you now have a technology which reduces search and matching friction, and that allows to use this underutilized capacity and allow people who, for multiple reasons, choose not to own a car to now have one when they need one. So we can see intuitively that there is lots of potential gains from trade from having these platforms. And so what I'm going to do is sort of intuitively list the forces that we think are the most important ones. And then I'll present you a model that formalizes all that. So as far as the gains from trade is concerned, well, obviously, one obvious one that I hinted at earlier is that someone that say I don't have the resources to buy a car, but I may wish to rent a very nice Tesla for the weekend to take my girlfriend away, visit some countryside. You may also allow trade between someone whose utilization rate is high enough to justify ownership, but has this extra capacity of time that he's not using, that may decide to trade with someone whose utilization rate is too low to justify ownership, and can then generate gain from trade between these two persons. And you can also generate gains from trade over time by, since people have income and preference shock, they may want to smooth these shocks over time and then also generate some gains. So that's interesting, but if you want to design policy, you may want to think about what are the indirect effects of these platforms. So you may want to think about what will happen if you design a policy experiment and say something that the city of San Francisco is doing now is subsidizing parking spots. So you may want to think what are going to be the indirect effect on the market, on price and quantities of cars, and the welfare effects as these markets become liquid and widespread. So the type of effects that we think matter are, for instance, the fact that when a car, allowing a car to be rented creates an option value, right? Because basically you can now choose to purchase it, knowing that when you're not going to need it, you're going to be able to rent it. So in some sense, it pushes its value up. On the other hand, the fact that the car is used more intensely as a result of rental makes it depreciate faster. So it's going to decrease its lifetime and potentially decrease its value in equilibrium. So you have these counter-balancing effects, and it's not clear what the sum of all these effects will be as frictions diminishes. So that's what we're trying to focus on, and that's the topic of the paper. So what we do is we're going to build a model that captures the features that I've just described. We're going to then estimate it in the data, and we're going to run some counterfactual analysis with this machinery to see what we expect to happen. So to give you more details, the model will have several features. So first, we're going to have heterogeneous consumers who have different sensitivity to prices, think of income levels, and different utilization rates. We're going to have goods of different qualities, newer car, older cars. And we're going to have different types of markets. We're going to have markets where people can resell their old car when they don't want it anymore. And we're going to have these new peer-to-peer rental markets where people can rent their cars when they wish. And we're going to introduce what we think are the most important frictions to explain choices, which are the transaction cost in the resale market, which we observe are function of the rate at which cars are used. So that's one thing we're going to estimate in the data in the second part. And we're also going to introduce a rate of physical depreciation of the durable goods, which corresponds to the fact that, cars become obsolete after a while, they tend to break more often, and people tend to scrape them as a result. And this behavior is also a function of usage. So that's also something we're estimating in the data. And finally, our policy experiment is going to be mostly in varying the level of friction in the peer-to-peer rental market. So the model is going to account for the fact that these markets are still relatively small in size. So we're going to have a parameter which controls for that, which varies the level at which people have access to this rental market at this stage, and also the level of friction that they face. So what David was hinting at, the fact that when you wish to rent, you don't find a car 100% of the time, and when you supply your car, you don't actually rent it 100% of the time. So that's what the model will look like. We're going to estimate it with 2 years of transactional data from the peer-to-peer platform. That's a proprietary data set that comes from GetAround, as well as some publicly available data from to estimate the period cost of car ownership, the transaction cost function that I mentioned, and the rate at which cars tend to be replaced as the function of their usage. Okay, I'll skip the literature review just to tell you that it's building on some literature in I/O and complementing the increasing literature and the sharing economy. But the main novelty of the model is introducing these peer-to-peer markets in some more traditional model in I/O. Okay, so I'm going to have 3 slides with the model. I'll try to give you a sense, some intuition of what's being done. So just bear with me for 3 slides. So I'm first going to describe the consumers, then the goods they can trade and how they trade them, like how the market's clear, and then the estimation. So we have a mass of consumer, mass 1. The model is dynamic, so they discount the future at rate beta, and beta is simple version, same for everybody. We restrict the consumers to be able to hold almost one good at the time. It's a strong assumption, but it's tremendously more complicated to expand the choice set to holding multiple goods. And these consumers are going to be heterogeneous in 4 dimensions. So their sensitivity to price, which is called theta in the model, their utilization rate, which is called rho, and the level of frictions in the rental market, which are gamma S and gamma D. So gamma S represents the fact that given that you choose to supply your car on the platform, it's going to be rented at gamma S % of the time. And gamma D represents the fact that when you start searching for a car on the platform, you're going to find one gamma D % of the time. So in the estimation, to give you an intuition, gamma S is something like 10%, and gamma D is something like 60% in the baseline estimation. But we are going to simulate and change the range for the parameter. Yes?
So those parameters aren't part of an equilibrium calculation? They're just...
They are reduced form, yeah. I'm calibrating them in equilibrium.
Well, okay.
I'm calibrating them in equilibrium, but they are reduced form. There's some deeper forces here that I'm not modeling. And so to give you, and the rate rho here is like the unconditional usage rate, right? So the one that we observe in the distribution of usage is the distribution of usage conditional on being an owner of a car. So I'm actually going to estimate the distribution of usage unconditionally on, not conditionally on owning a car or not. But I'm going to show that as we move on. Okay, so what can these consumers do? They can purchase goods, and to simplify, we're just going to dichotomize the space of goods between newer goods, which are indexed by 0, and older goods, which are indexed by 1. And the outside option is going to be indexed by 2. That's the choice of not owning any good. so here is the model is dynamic, but here is the period utility from owning a good of vintage A. When you and B represents the indicator. It's an indicator of choosing to rent, so it's equal to 1 if you choose to rent. So if you're an owner, you have to pay a fixed cost of ownership. So that's one of the main difference between being an owner and being not being an owner. You have to pay this cap out, which is the fixed cost of ownership, and you get a flow of utility XA, which is the maximum flow you can get from a car, that's multiplied by the rate at which you utilize your car. Then, if you choose to rent, you have this extra utility flow here, which is a function of the fraction of time your car actually gets rented when you supply it, and the non-utilized flow, and also multiplied by the rental rate that's determined in equilibrium. And then you have these preference shocks, which captures the fact that people don't enjoy their car as much every period. But some year you may want to go on vacation 10 times, and some year you might want to stay at home. And so these shocks capture this type of change in preferences. For the non-owner, you have this utility flow, which is mirroring the other one, except that the difference is that when you choose a vintage B hat, you also get the same flow, but your cost is now variable. It's proportional to your usage. And the utility flow is then multiplied by the fraction gamma D, which is the friction on the platform. Okay, so I'll just skip quickly to the resolution of the model is very standard. We clear rental market and resale market, and there is a transaction cost in the resale market, which is a function of usage, as I mentioned in the introduction. So the transaction cost function is actually a function of rho, your usage rate, plus the extra usage which comes from rental. So if you decide to rent, you get a revenue out of it, but the price, the value that you receive when you resell your car is lower. That's the sort of trade-off that you're facing. Yes?
Is gamma S the probability I'll successfully clear a transaction when I want to, or is it the fraction of time my car that I have available on the platform is actually utilized by
The latter.
The latter. And same with gamma D.
Yes.
The fraction of time I get it.
Yes.
I thought when you defined gamma, it was like capturing the transaction costs of rental. That seems more like gamma D. I don't want to drive the car 100% of the time. Like if I'm using the platform, I might want to drive the car 5% of the time. So gamma D is at most 5%. But maybe sometimes I want to and I can't. There's two mics, so
Oh, okay.
stay away from that mic. Maybe we'll turn that one off. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes. So I think I understand your question. Should I turn this off somehow?
I don't think
I'll just stay there. Gamma D is not a choice. It's a friction that you're facing. So your choice of usage. Let me take that back. Your level of usage is rho, and is exogenously fixed. It's
as a supplier, but as a demander.
As a demander is the same thing. Everybody has a rho. You live far away from New York in New Jersey, and your rho corresponds to the fact that every day you have to take your car to go to work. Exactly.
Demander is how much I want to use a car, but supplier how much I use my actual car.
Yeah. So, and then you're facing these frictions, which corresponds to, perhaps the fact that the matching algorithm is not perfect, or perhaps the fact that you wish to use it at a time where there is, not enough supply or something. So that's the friction in itself is a bit reduced form, but does not correspond to your preference.
So the fact that sometimes you do not get to use the car, you just can assume that corresponds to utility 0, so there is no kind of big downside, like a negative utility for not being able to get the car when you want it.
It's just...
So you assume that everything is just kind of like adjusted for that, or just kind of should I think about it as a scale?
You can think about it as a scale.
Or I guess shift, not this. Shift, okay.
Okay, and then so the model is dynamic, so we solve it dynamically. It's very standard. The data are in the paper. I'm not going to get into them now, but I'm happy to talk about them more later. How do we estimate it? How do we solve the equilibrium? Well, there's a bunch of parameters that we directly estimate from the data. The ones we cannot estimate directly from the data, we calibrate them by minimizing the difference between what we observe in the data and what the model predicts. And we get the missing parameters that way. And so I'll move through that quickly and show you the policy experiment result, which I think is really the meat of what we're doing. So in terms of estimation, here I'm estimating the transaction cost function tau. It's a function of usage rho. So I'm scraping a bunch of price of used vehicle from this website called NADA, and I'm building these transaction cost curves as a function of usage and vintage, and I just take the average and use that in the estimation procedure. Yeah.
Explain that, sorry, just step back.
Yeah, of course.
Rho is how much I use the vehicle.
Yes.
Tau, there's like lots of transaction costs I can imagine this model, like pain of exchanging the keys when someone rents it and all this stuff.
I'm sorry.
There one specific transaction cost. Which transaction cost is this?
So it was. I went fast, so maybe it wasn't clear. This is the transaction cost that you pay when you resell your car. It has nothing to do with the peer-to-peer market here. This is when you go to a car dealer and you resell your car, you're going to.
This is just capturing depreciation.
This is just capturing market depreciation as far as the price of the car when you resell it is concerned, which is function usually of two variables: how old your car is and how much it's been used.
Got it.
So 60%, that means that you only get 60% of the true value. Wait, you're saying?
Yeah, it's actually when usage is around 5%. At the average usage rate, it's so here the blue line corresponds when I scrape a bunch of very common cars, and I average the difference between the price at which you buy them old and the price at which you sell them old, and I look at what's the fraction of the price that gives me, and I average across car. I get this curve as a function of the number of miles that the car has been driven.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
transaction seems like a strange word for that. Anyway, let's move on.
Okay. Here, on the other hand, what I want to capture is that rate of physical depreciation. So the fact that cars become obsolete after a while, they're too old, they tend to break too often, and people tend to just scrape them. So what you observe in the model tells you that this quantity in equilibrium will be the fraction of new car that enter the system over the total stock of car. So if you take this ratio and you condition it on usage, you get a rate of replacement of car at different level of usage. So these are the blue dots that I have. The data is a little sparse, but I try to fit a line to that by just cutting some of the outliers. And that's also one estimate that I use directly in the model. Other quantities that I'm not going to get into, there's nothing, this is all standard. As I said, the second step is for the parameters I cannot directly estimate, like the utility parameters, which are constant. I calibrate them by minimizing the difference between some fractions that I observe in the data. For instance, fraction of above median income households who purchase a new car, et cetera, et cetera. So I find a bunch of these quantities that I can estimate directly in the data, look at their counterpart in the model, and find the parameters which minimize the difference. Okay. And finally, from the platform data, I'm trying to get a sense of what's the current level of friction that we observe. So I look at the fraction of time cars are available, and the fraction of time that it gets rented. The model predicts that that's going to give me the distribution for gamma S. Yes.
Do you try to do any kind of out-of-sample evaluation of how good your calibration is? Just say calibrated. Like, is there any simple way how to do it so that you are somehow not overfitting the? Even I mean, you have 7.
Yes. Which part are you worried about me overfitting?
So I guess like in general, right? When you're calibrating, and then I presume that at some point then you'll just move on to doing counterfactuals, right? Then
Yeah.
you kind of need
So
to worry that I mean, if you worry about like how predictable those counterfactuals are for the conditions that you change, it would be nice to do like some
course.
evaluation, say I guess San Francisco versus New York or something.
Super valid point. I did counterfactual on this. So basically, by here in the baseline, I'm using the average age transaction cost function at the average age. But I looked at for one curve below and one curve above. And here, too, I looked at one standard deviation below, standard deviation above. This doesn't have a lot of effect on the result. What does have a lot of effect on the result is what I'm going to get to now, is the level of friction in the peer-to-peer market. So that's basically what the results are very sensitive to. And so in the baseline estimate, I use the level of friction that I observe today, and I assume that people over time start to using the platform more because they become more aware of it. The system enters new cities. It becomes legitimized. I mean, all these things is super reduced form, right? It's just one parameter in my model. There is a lot of things going on in the background, of course. But in the baseline scenario, I assume that the level of friction on average stay constant. I'm going to do actually several simulations where I instead of making this assumption, I assume that perhaps the people that we actually observe now on the platform are the ones that are facing the lower level of friction, but that other people are opting out because the level of friction they would face would be higher, and perhaps there is not enough benefit for them at this point. So that's what I call the baseline result. Then there is going to be, I'm just keeping and going back to the baseline, but that's going to be the low liquidity result, where the average level of friction is, so this is liquidity, so the average level of friction is higher, and high liquidity when the average level of friction is lower. But just to illustrate what happens in the baseline, basically across the different calibration, the directional effects don't change. It's the magnitude that change. And we think that here we're varying access to up to 100%. It's likely that the world is not going to look like that at the 100% level of access. There's going to be a lot of other forces, competitive forces that are going on, but at least it gives us a pretty good directional sense of for the combined effects. So just 4 or 5 observations from this table. The first one is that we observe a shift away from ownership. So the first 2 lines shows you that ownership tends to go down. So we can go into the details in the number in a second, but here ownership tends to go down. And on the other hand, there is a big shift towards non-ownership, right? So the fraction, these are fractional numbers. So here, when you have 25% level of access, the level of the increase in the percentage of non-owners increased by 86%. And at 100% level of access, it increased by a factor of more than 3, actually. Other interesting things to notice is that cars tend to be used more intensely. So that's the rate at which cars are used as, the increase in the rate at which cars are used as you increase access. So remember,
do you see any, so it looks like the effect is actually linear, right? Like, I mean, you kind of expect that, 86 to 160 to 243 to 320. So you do not see any market size effect?
Or is there not enough identification in the model in order to
Okay,
apply
okay.
some of this more
Right,
non-linear
last
thing?
because you're fixing the supply and demand friction, so you expect linearity there. Right?
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
Do you expect that?
I mean,
Does that,
you can refine the model for gamma S and gamma D, which I'm not doing at this point. That's clearly like the next step to make this more robust. On the other hand, so you observed like that cars are used more intensely, obviously. So you remember that the starting point was 5%. As you increase access, it increased by, on average, so 30% for new cars and 60% for older cars. So that means that you go from 5% of usage to something like 8% of usage. So it's
on Miro's point, which I'm a little confused about,
Yeah.
is this relationship between fraction of consumers with peer-to-peer access and the baseline friction rates. So wouldn't they be endogenously connected? So as the fraction of consumers increases, your friction rates are going to change. Like,
so perhaps this is not this notation is not perfectly clear. What I mean by when I increase access, it means
is an exogenous shift in access.
it means yes. So it means that there is a fraction of when am I 25.
If the friction is endogenous, the percentage of people who have peer-to-peer access.
Yes. So let me rephrase your point. When you have 25% of access, it means that 25% of people will face a level of friction of 10% on average, and for gamma S, and 60% of average of friction on the demand side on average for gamma D. The remaining 75% will be as if their level of friction is equal to 0. Mm-hmm. Okay, so conditional on having access, this is your mean. Now, so the frictions are not constant per se. They are constant for the ones who have access. So as you increase access, well, it changes the liquidity on both sides. We don't exactly know how, given that it's reduced form. So that's why we run different counterfactuals. Okay. So cars use more intensely. The corollary is that the average age of the car tends to go down, right? Cars tend to be replaced faster. The shift is not dramatic, but it's still, it's not in the model, but you can think of environmental benefits of having younger cars on the road. They tend to pollute less. And when it comes to change in consumer surplus, so here it goes from an increase from 0.8% to 3%, 100% of access. So to give you a benchmark, the literature converges on the fact that by suppressing frictions from secondary market for car resale leads to an increase in consumer surplus of around 2%. So we're certainly in the same zone, but in the more optimistic scenario with a higher liquidity, you can reach something like 6% in the very optimistic world. So we see.
So if this is the line that you care about, right?
Yeah, and it's not huge.
Linear, right? You're still linear in that line, right? It looks like at the first sight that you're.
Yeah, I mean, it's not obvious ex ante to me that it's going to be linear, because you have some nonlinearities in the effect of the rate of depreciation on your value or the transaction cost on your value, which is a function of usage, and that induce some nonlinearities. But before estimating the parameters, I don't think it's obvious that those nonlinearities are not going to play out that much. But I'm happy to talk more about this. Yeah. Okay, and the last point I want to make is about the distributional effects. So just quickly, because I'm running out of time. Here, that's a picture of the increase in the changes in consumer surplus in the 3 liquidity scenarios that I mentioned. So that's the baseline, low liquidity, high liquidity. Here I'm showing the increase in consumer surplus as access increases, the free liquidity scenario. And the blue line represents the change in consumer surplus for below medium income household. And the red bars represent the changes for above medium income household. You see that consistently, so the level of changes, of course, is higher when you have more liquidity, but what's interesting is the contrast shows that the gains are almost always 2 to 3 times higher for below medium income households. So that's what we see as one of the most interesting points in the paper is that these markets, in some sense, have the possibility by expanding the choice set of consumers, allowing them to avoid this fixed cost of ownership and other forces to make lower income people better off primarily. Okay, so that's the key takeaway. Shift away from ownership. Gains in consumer surplus, which are comparable to what you see in secondary market, but could be larger in optimistic scenarios, and distributional effects, which tend to favor below medium income people. Okay, so I can talk to you more about the extensions offline. Some policy experiments we're running where we're looking at the effect of subsidizing parking spots. But in the interest of time, I'd like to move on to the next.
Can I ask you one question?
Yes.
It seems that one of the things this paper has to face is that Zipcar is worth, to a first order approximation, Enterprise bought it for $500 million, $300 million. Uber's worth $40 billion. Right?
Yeah.
So those are vastly different numbers. And it seems that with car ownership, the utilization rate, it's really time dependent. Rush hour tells me that right off the bat, right? So
of course, yeah.
Everyone wants to use the car at the same time, and then there's lots of periods of time where basically there's very little demand.
Yeah.
Both from car owners and non-car owners. Right now, there's
Yeah.
lots of cars that are available, underutilized, but there's not a lot of demand for them. So how would if you really drive those parameters down, if you put time dependence in the model, can you break peer sharing? Is there could you add that to the model, and where does it break? Because either your paper says there's this huge opportunity the economy's missing.
Yeah.
The model shows it'd be a great benefit, but it's not taken off. Zipcar's worth nothing to a first order. Or the model is wrong, and we can actually put something in the model to explain reality. And there are two completely different implications of the model. One it says in equilibrium we got this awesome outcome, and one says maybe not. So I don't know where you come down.
Right. I don't know if the model can answer that at this point, but I think so. In some sense, here I'm not distinguishing between what's the utilization rate at different time of the day. For me, all of this is homogeneous at this point. So that's clearly one thing that would answer your question if I were to put different values on usage time at different time of the day and see which time of the day is more valuable,
right, and
see what the model predicts by doing that. In some sense, it's captured in reduced form so in some sense, it's not realistic to say that your car is going to be rented. When you supply it, your car is going to potentially be rented 100% of the time because, of course, nobody cares about having a car during the night. Most people don't. So it's partially captured by the fact that we are not pushing that friction to an unrealistic level. But even keeping the parameters in a reasonable range and looking at what usage distribution looks like given the current parameter, we're still finding interesting effects. So we think that it's still valuable. Now, the other forces that would operate in the range you're talking about, when there start to be competition between people at different hours of the day and price that adjust, that really cannot answer that. So I
guess that's a good response, but my question would be, do you come down on the side of if this took off, the paper sort of says if usage is high enough, we have this good equilibrium outcome, which
Yeah.
is great consumer surplus.
Yeah.
But of course, if no one's using the app, then although it's not directly modeled, but it does show that policy exercise shows that the impact will be minimal and these platforms won't be worth very much. So we sort of, maybe we're stuck in like the bad state. Is that where you come down, or is it there, is that where you really believe that this might take off? So everyone's saying peer-to-peer car sharing is never going to happen. They're running this risk of speaking too soon. Is that like, if you're making a prediction today, in 5 years, is one of these platforms worth $10 billion, $20 billion?
Well, one is already worth $10 billion or more. It's Uber, but the model is slightly different. But
It's not Uber.
no, it's not Uber at all. I agree.
It's like a get around or a gift card.
It's facing but my point remains, which is that it's facing strong competition. So in a sense, here I'm not taking into account the fact that they are. I'm assuming that the outside option is sort of fixed. You would want to. In order to make a.
Sure, Uber changes
In order to make a
yeah.
good prediction on what you're asking me, I don't think I can make it. I think it's too far out of sample to really make it with the current machinery that I have. I think that crucially, the outside option is changing dramatically right now, and so I'm showing a piece of the component of the utility function of the guy that's not an owner and that has this new option in his choice set that's making him happier, but the other component that I'm not modeling is changing through time. And in order to make a valid prediction, I think I would need to explain more of that component. Okay? I mean, we can always talk more later. But. Okay, so let me delve into the second paper. And in order for perhaps to keep your attention, I'm just going to give you 1 minute of connection between the previous project and this one, because ex ante perhaps they seem orthogonal, but they're not. So here, the idea is I've been showing you like what happens to the world where you have this peer-to-peer platform and you sort of magically reduce the friction because you have this great matching algorithm or cities that decide to subsidize parking spots or things like that. But of course, it's sort of unrealistic to think that that's going to be enough to completely eradicate frictions in peer-to-peer markets. And there's a lot of other factors that matter a lot. For instance, just by the incompleteness of the contracts that takes place, you need a lot of trust between people to make this platform work. To let someone use your car on Get Around or to rent your apartment on Airbnb, you clearly need a massive amount of trust in the system and in the person you're transacting with. Another example is another company we're partnering with called BlaBlaCar that's allowing car owners to supply a seat in their car when they're traveling, so say from Paris to Berlin or whatever for a long travel like this. So, and I mean, I know the name of the company sounds funny, but it's the size of Amtrak in terms of volume. So to build such an infrastructure, you actually need a lot of trust. So what I'm trying to get to is that we want to understand the role of trust in these platforms. And in order to do that, we've partnered with a company called Treti, from which two of our co-authors are from. Their goal is to build the trust infrastructure for the sharing economy. So they want to centralize all the digital social capital, or actually all forms of social capital of their users in one place, and allow their users to then potentially transact on any platform on which they don't have any history. So think of something like a credit history to get a loan, but for the digital world. So our partnership with them, so the long-term goal is to actually run economic trust games with their users. And they are actually in the process of building a platform for us to do that. But in the process, we've been starting to look at their data. And one interesting thing about their data is that they have the result of, for 2.1 million of their users, they have the result of a 5-factor personality test. And they also have the Facebook network of these users. So it gets us interested into looking at the relationship between personality and social network. And that's the topic of the next paper. That's the. Okay, so just quickly on the motivation. Not teach anyone here what's assortative mixing. Here we're looking more specifically at homophily, the propensity to form ties with people who are similar to you. There's lots of literature on status homophily, and here we're more interested in the homophily in personality traits. And we think it's interesting because it's a plausible cause for friendship formation, and I think one of the last piece of evidence that I'll show you, I think is a good supportive evidence for that. Okay, so lots of interesting work on the topic of homophily, and Ors is the first to look at a large-scale population and try to measure homophily in personality traits in a large-scale population. This is what the Traity platform looks like. This is what your personality test looks like. So I can give you the details on that's me taking the test. It's Arun taking the test. And I recommend all of you to take the test. It's enjoyable. This is what it looks like. You have so once you ask to take this personality test, you have a set of 100 questions. Pardon? You have a question? Oh, okay. So you have a set of 100 questions chosen at random. That's divided into sets of 20 questions drawn randomly. And so each set of 20 questions produces a signal towards one of the 5 personality dimensions. Then the signal is averaged, and that gives you a score in each of the 5 dimensions. So just
Why do people take the test?
why do people take the test? So because either they enjoy knowing their personality, or they are recommended by their friends to actually take the test. So there is a bit of a selection effect here going on. That's my speculation. So you answer a question like this, talk to a lot of people at parties, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we actually select a sample from the Traity data set. And the way we do it was originally in order to run the trust game I mentioned to you. So let me describe how we run it, how we selected the data set. So we started by randomly selecting a set of Traity users for which we had personality data. So these are the black nodes here. So from this user, we then search for all the friends of that user on Facebook. And the ones that are Traity users, we then iterated and find all of her friends. Among her friends, so that's for level 1, among her friends, we are now at level 2, and again, we looked for all the friends of the Traity user in level 2. So every time we have someone that's not a Traity user in the set of friends that we find in this procedure, we cannot actually access his friends' information. So we have to stop here. But for Traity users, we can keep going. So we kept going until level 3. So overall, our data sets consist of the sampling procedure that I described repeated many times. That gives us, so every time we repeat this procedure, we gather for all the nodes for which it's available the personality tests across the 5 dimensions. And so that gives us a set of more than 178,000 users for which we have personality tests, and more than 550,000 edges between them. In addition, we have a set of more than 25 million non-user friends and almost 60 million edges between them. So that allows us to compute for each pair So for each pair of users, like this one, this pair here, if the two users are on the platform and have taken the personality test, that can exactly compute the number of common friends that they have on Facebook. Okay, so there are several results in the paper. Let me just focus on two of them. For the first one, we want to test whether or not there is homophily in personality traits. So for that, we're going to use two comparison groups. On the left panel, what we're doing is we're comparing the set of friends to a set of 100 random sample of randomly selected people. So in each of these 100 random sample, what I'm doing is I'm just forming pairs of users drawn at random. And I'm computing a set of pairs of people selected at random, and I'm computing the average personality distance for that random sample number 1. And I'm repeating it for 100 random sample. And that gives me the box in red here. So here what I'm plotting is for each personality trait, the blue dot corresponds to the average personality distance between friends, and that I'm normalizing at 0. And the red box represents the distribution of the average distance across the random sample that I just described. So the distribution of the average personality distance across these random samples. Yes?
So what are the units on the y-axis?
So here, on average, the personality distance for friends is something like 20. It's 19 or 20.
Questions? 20,
So
20 what?
So in one dimension, your test is going to be something like 60 or 70 on average as a node. So when you look at what's the average difference between scores for friends, pairs, on average it's something like 20.
Why isn't it 0 exactly? Because if you subtract friend A minus friend B, and you also have friend B minus friend A, those completely cancel at 0. So, or you're talking absolute value difference?
Absolute value, I'm sorry. Yeah, the absolute value.
So you're saying your uniform sample actually is more different than random? So those are...
So this is the distance among friends, and this is the distance among a set of 100 random sample of people taken at random. So what I'm saying is that the average distance in this set of randomly drawn sample is larger than for the friend. Was it clear? Okay. So that's drawing people at random. Here I'm repeating the operation, but by reshuffling the edges instead of just drawing people at random. So I just reshuffle all the edges that allows me to preserve the degree distribution in the random sample. But we see that the homophily result remains. And so I'm just going to go quickly and say that we wanted to go one step deeper and try to see if that result is the basis of a model of network formation. And so what we get interested in is by looking at how this distance varies with the fraction of shared friends for each pair. So here I'm just looking at the set of friends pairs. Each of these panels represents a personality trait. So let's look at the first one for now. What I'm showing here is, you see 5 points. They correspond to 5 buckets of the fraction of shared friends between pairs. So the first bucket is looking at observation for which the fraction of shared friends is between 0 and 5%. The next bucket, 5 to 10%, 10 to 15%, 15 to 20, and above 20%. In each of these buckets, I average the absolute difference in personality score. And that gives me the shape that we observe here for agreeableness, then conscientiousness, emotional stability, extraversion, and openness.
Again, mimicking Sid's question.
Yeah.
Even if we assume that this is statistically significant difference, should we assume this is a meaningful difference here? If you're talking about a scale that's running from 0 to 60, and you're looking at differences that are 0.2, 0.4.
Yeah, very valid point. Is it a meaningful significance? I don't think it's huge, but I think that the trend is showing us something about a directional effect that's interesting that I'm going to get to in a second. So that's for the friends. We observe that there's a statistically significant decrease in distance as percentage of common friends increases. So I just want to...
How much are these big five? So do you have, I mean, are they predictable by, say, age, by ethnicity, by other sort of socioeconomic properties?
So when I condition on dummies for age and the city they live in just a basic logistic regression for homophily, here the result remains. When I include companies and school, some coefficient becomes insignificant, but the sample is also much smaller, and there may be a selection effect into showing that you've been to some companies. It's actually interesting because it disappears for like extraversion, and openness, I think. So perhaps it means that you're actually, choosing to display your company because you're open, and that's sort of what you're capturing. But we can talk about this more afterwards. It's almost time to. Okay, so what I really want to show is this. That's now when I look at all the pairs of non-friends in my sample. So there is actually 42 million combinations of pairs which are not friends, but share at least one friend in common. So I look at that big set, and I do the same conditioning that I just explained previously. I bucket in 5, and I look at the average distance in these 5 buckets. And what you observe is that, at least for trait agreeableness, conscientiousness, extraversion, and openness, the average distance in personality between non-friends tends to increase with the fraction of shared friends. So if you now try to tie that to theory of network formation, and you want to think of network formation simply as something that combines preference bias for someone that's similar to you, perhaps, and matching opportunities. Then this is perhaps, we see this as evidence that you need these two features in order to explain the patterns that we see here. So here if you want, for instance, to proxy meeting opportunities by the fraction of shared friends, then you see that there is a positive correlation between meeting opportunities and personality distance, and personality similarity. So more meeting opportunities increase when personality similarity increases. Okay, so it sort of rules out the possibility that the mating process is exogenous, since you observe this positive correlation. Okay. And on the other hand, what you observe for the non-friends is that as meeting opportunity increases, for non-friends to still not want to be friends, their personality distance has to increase to compensate the fact that they are more likely to meet. And as a result, they must really dislike each other more and more in order not to create a link.
So you have like 1 more minute to wrap up.
That's it basically. So that's just the regression to show the slopes of the same evidence that I just mentioned. So we see evidence of homophily across the 5 traits and the basis for a model of network formation. The next step is to actually use this data, make pairs of users play trust games, look at how the outcome of the trust game varies with embeddedness of the degree with the degree of embeddedness of a pair, and perhaps also test whether there is homophily in trustworthiness of nodes and how it also varies with embeddedness. So we can talk about this more after the talk.
So Sam will be at lunch with us. If you guys want to ask any questions, or he does have, I guess, a great faucet if someone wants to fill in if they really want to meet with him. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Thank you.